morning, everyone. On this very rainy Tuesday morning, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Megan Gath, who is Senior Lecturer and Researcher for the Child Wellbeing Research Institute in the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. Just before we get going, it's just to tell everybody that this session will be recorded because we appreciate at 8 o'clock in the morning. That's quite tricky to make around work and school runs, etc. And also, if you have any questions, please could you put them in the Q&A box, and me and Bella will present these questions to Megan at the end of the talk on your behalf. So we're delighted to welcome you, Megan. Your research around early years and the impacts of screens has been utterly captivating for us and extremely relevant given what we're seeing and the patterns we're seeing in the UK. Reading something from the conclusions from your research, which we're excited to hear about next, when you wrote, we found a linear relationship. So the more screen time these young children were exposed to, the worse they fared in terms of outcomes. And that was most evident at the highest levels of screen exposure. We're delighted to welcome you, Megan. The floor is yours, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here to speak with you today. And thanks to those who have joined so early in the morning for you. I'm sorry about that. I will just bring up my slides here. So I'm Megan Gath, and I work for the Child Wellbeing Research Institute at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. My background is in developmental psychology. My research has always had a focus on kind of children's social and emotional development, and particularly influences of the home environment. And so, something about children's home environments that's become quite salient over the last few years is their screen media use. So over the last few years, my research has really been focused on children's screen media use in relation to a range of different developmental outcomes, with a focus on kind of the early childhood years. So just before I get into talking about some of my research, I thought I'd kind of set the scene a little bit, and something that I probably don't need to tell you, but that we all probably know is that over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen the emergence of kind of newer forms of screen media and different types of digital devices. And what this has meant for children is an increasing amount of their time each day being spent on screens. And so in our research, when we're talking about screen time, we kind of include anything that you can probably think of in terms of screen time. So watching TV and videos, using gaming devices, tablets, smartphones, and sometimes we also include what's called background television. And that's just if the television is on in the same room as the child, even if they're not paying attention to it. And so the World Health Organization has set out their recommendations in terms of what they, what they recommend in terms of a daily amount of screen time for young children. And so for children under the age of 2, they recommend no sedentary screen time, less than 1 hour per day for children aged 2 to 4, and less than 2 hours per day for children aged 5 and over. And so what research is showing kind of internationally is that most children are exceeding these daily screen time recommendations. So here in New Zealand, our data shows that 50% of 2-year-olds and 80% of 3 to 4-year-olds are exceeding these recommendations. And so preschoolers on average are being exposed to about 3 to 4 hours per day of screen time. And I think that is a pattern that's kind of seen internationally. And so why might this be a concern that children are spending so much time on screens? Well, there's a kind of a growing, base of literature that's showing that higher levels of screen time in early childhood kind of predicts poor outcomes across a range of different developmental outcomes. So things like vision, obesity, sleep, attention, language skills, cognitive skills, and behavior. And I think why also just thinking about the amount of time children are spending on screens might be a concern is just what we know about the kind of critical importance of social interactions, observational learning, and opportunities for exploration and play during those early childhood years. And so in my research, I've largely looked at children's language skills and social skills. And so when we're thinking about language skills, this is things like their expressive and receptive vocabulary and their listening comprehension. So how well they can understand spoken language. And then social skills includes communication skills, including nonverbal skills, conflict resolution skills, as well as the ability to build positive friendships. And why I kind of focus on these skills is just kind of the foundational importance of these skills. These are skills that really the foundations are set during early childhood, and they have quite wide-ranging impacts in terms of predicting success across a wide range of different domains later in life. So things like adult relationships, physical health, mental health, academic and employment success, and even criminal offending. So these are some really important skills that we need to get right from the beginning. So I'll just talk a little bit again before I get into some of my studies about just why we might expect that there could be a negative impact of children's screen time on these kind of language and social skills. So I'll talk about kind of three mechanisms here. So the first being the video deficit effect, also impacts on children's social and linguistic environment, and then the displacement of other activities. And so the video deficit effect is a phenomenon that was identified in 2005, and this has been replicated, across a wide range of different experimental paradigms. And what this refers to is the relatively poor ability of infants and young children to transfer learning from screen-based media to real-life situations compared to learning from a live model. So if children are presented with information through video or screen format, they're much less likely to remember that information and to be able to apply that information than if the exact same information is given to them through a face-to-face interaction. So young children's brains are really just primed to be learning from those face-to-face interactions. And so this has been seen to be a domain general skill. So it's observed across, perceptual, cognitive, language, and socio-emotional domains. And so it's kind of most evident during the toddler years, so kind of peaks around age 3, and then persists to age 5, where we see this deficit between learning from screens versus learning in person. But, after the age of 5, children, become much more able to learn from screen media. And so the idea is that kind of at the time that children are learning skills, so when they're becoming consolidated, that's when we see the strongest deficit. So for some of those more advanced skills, we see them at more of an older age. And just interestingly, we do see some brain imaging evidence of this phenomenon as well. So infants show neural activity in motor areas of the brain, so those involved in performing actions with objects when they observe a real life demonstration, but not when they view that same demonstration on video. And then, so another reason why screen time might have some potentially negative impacts for children is impacts on their social and linguistic environment. So research has shown that interactions and vocalizations between family members change in the presence of screen media, and that's even if it's just the television on in the background. Family members initiate fewer interactions, and when they do, they use fewer vocalizations when there is some type of screen media present in the environment. And so this is in the field called technoference. So when screen time interferes with opportunities for talk and interactions between parents and children. And so some research in Australia recently looked at this by using some electronic noise capture of the home environment of toddlers and kind of confirmed this. So they found that increases in screen time in the environment were associated with decreases in measures of parent-child talk. So the number of words the adults used, the number of vocalizations from the child, and the conversational turns. And so this is just really important to consider in terms of what we know about the critical importance of language input and these types of back and forth conversation-like interactions for child language and social development during early childhood. And then the last kind of reason why we might expect some negative impacts of screen time is just the displacement of other activities, which is just the idea that all that time that children are spending on screens is taking time away from other activities that might be more beneficial for their development. Things like playing with toys, playing outside, interacting with siblings or peers, or reading books. And so this is just kind of one conceptual model of this here. So this is just saying if we know that things like physical activity and social interaction have these positive impacts across all these different domains, sleep, physical health, cognition, etc., then if we know that screen time is decreasing these types of activities, physical activity, social interaction, we're going to see those flow-on effects of reducing these kind of positive outcomes. Okay, so now I'll move to talking about some of my own research over the last few years. And so in this first study, we were interested in looking at preschoolers' screen time in relation to their social development. But what we were really interested in doing in this study was testing the displacement hypothesis. So we were interested in seeing if we see a negative impact of preschoolers' screen time on aspects of their social development, is it because screen time has, displaced these other more beneficial activities? So in this study, we had 84 parents and their preschoolers who were either 3 or 4 years old take part. Parents reported on their child's screen use, aspects of the home environment, and the parent-child relationship. And then we had our team of speech-language therapists assess children on their language production, so their expressive language skills, and on their comprehension, so how well they could recall aspects of a story. And so we did find that the more time children spent watching television and using electronic media, the lower they scored on these measures of language, as well as a measure of the parent-child relationship. But as I said, what we were really interested in doing in this study was kind of testing this displacement hypothesis. So we used a path analysis model, and what you see here is the final model that we arrived at that had the best fit to the data. So I'll kind of take you through these findings, but we found that there was kind of 2 indirect pathways here. So the first thing that we found was that screen time was related to children's language outcomes through its association with reduced time spent in shared reading. So the more time children were spending watching TV and using electronic media, the less time they were engaging in shared reading with the parent in the home. And this was what was having effects on their language production and their language comprehension. Then we found another set of indirect pathways where screen time was related to aspects of the parent-child relationship through its association with reduced frequency of quality interactions. So again, the more time children were on screens, the less time they were spending engaged in quality interactions with their parents, and this kind of increased conflict within the parent-child relationship and resulted in lower parent-child closeness. And so from this study, we were able to show that, yes, there was a negative association between screen time in early childhood and children's language skills and aspects of the parent-child relationship. And we did find some evidence that screen time may be displacing other activities that might be more beneficial for children's language and social development. However, there were a number of limitations of this study. So first of all, it was a cross-sectional study. So all the data was collected at the same time. So we're not really able to determine the directionality of what's causing what. And we also had a limited ability to control or adjust for some kind of confounding family social background characteristics. And this is really important in this type of research because there's a lot of different factors that you can probably think of that would influence both the amount of time that children spend on screens, as well as outcomes like their language and social skills. So things like maternal education and socioeconomic status. So it's really important that we make sure we control for these kinds of things to kind of get at the unique or independent effect of screen time. So that's what we look to do with our next couple of studies. And so most of the rest of the research that I'm going to talk about is using data from the Growing Up in New Zealand study. And so this is a large longitudinal study based at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, where they've been following over 6,000 children and their families since before they were born, so since the mothers were pregnant. And these youth are about 15 now. And so what's great about this study is because they followed these children and assessed them at various points across their childhood, we're able to look at what's happened for these children earlier in childhood and how that relates to their developmental outcomes as they get older. So in my research, I've looked at children's screen time from age 9 months up to age 8 years and looked at their developmental outcomes from between the ages of 5 and 12. So first of all, what we did was just kind of look at trends in screen time. So how much time are children spending on screens? And so this is just looking at the different types of screen time. So we can see that actually at age 2, that kind of background television, so just having the television on in the background, is the most common type of screen time children were exposed to. This decreased a bit across childhood, whereas the other types, the watching television, using electronic media, increased across childhood. And then when we combine those all together to kind of create this total screen exposure variable, that's that dashed line you can see at the top here. And so what this indicated that was within this sample at age 2, children were being exposed to about 3.5 hours of screen per day on average, and this increased to over 5 hours at age 8. But of course, what we were really interested in was looking at, well, how this screen time then related to children's developmental outcomes. And so in this particular analysis, the outcomes that I looked at were children's language skills again, so their kind of communication skills and their vocabulary, their early educational skills, so this was writing, letter fluency, and counting, and their peer problems. And so this was a construct that included things like not having any close friendships, not being well liked by other children, and preferring to play alone. And so what we found, so kind of the overall thing that we found was that higher levels of screen time at earlier points of childhood did predict lower language skills, lower educational skills, and higher peer problems at later ages. And so what these particular graphs here are showing are outcomes at age 5. So we've got language scores on the left and peer problems on the right, predicted from children's screen time at age 2. And so screen time has been divided here into quartiles, so 4 equal groups that we've labeled, so low screen time at age 2, mid-low, mid-high, and then high screen time at age 2. And then these are predicting their standardized scores at age 5. So if we look at the left-hand side, the language scores here, we can see that children who had the lowest screen time at age 2 are scoring highest in their language scores at age 5. Whereas those who had the highest screen time at age 2 are scoring lowest in their language scores at age 5. And we do see that kind of linear relationship there. So, the more screen time they have, the lower their language skills. And the difference in the color bars here is just showing that blue bar is showing kind of the unadjusted, the direct association. And that orange, the orange bars are after we adjusted for a range of those family background characteristics. So we controlled for things like maternal education, socioeconomic status, ethnicity. And so you can see that once we adjusted for these factors, this did reduce the effect of screen time on language outcomes, but it didn't get rid of the effect. There was still remained that effect of screen time there. And then if we look on the right-hand side, this is showing the same type of thing, but now looking at children's peer problems at age 5. And so here we can see kind of the flip. So children who had the lowest screen time at age 2 are now showing the lowest levels of peer problems at age 5, whereas those with the highest levels of screen time at age 2 show the highest levels of peer problems at age 5. Again, once we adjust for those family background characteristics, we see that the effect is reduced, but not eliminated. And so we were also interested in looking at, okay, well, how much screen time is too much? And so in this analysis, we just focused on the direct screen time. So we took out kind of the background television because we figured these kind of daily screen time recommendations are kind of focused on that direct time children are sitting looking at a screen. And so we predicted their outcomes. So this is language and educational ability at age 5, their peer problems at age 5 and age 8. And we plotted kind of the standardized and adjusted for those family background characteristics, mean outcomes based on hours of direct daily screen time at age 2. And what was really nice here is we actually see this kind of convergence that happened at 1.5 hours of screen time at age 2. So that was the point where children's language and educational ability dropped below the mean, and their levels of peer problems increased above the mean. So at 1.5 hours per day of screen time at age 2, which kind of roughly maps onto the recommendations, which would be 1 hour per day at this age. So from this study, what were kind of our key takeaways were that sociodemographic factors do explain some of the effect of screen time on outcomes, but even once we adjust for these, there was an independent effect of screen time that remained. So this figure here is just showing the different factors that we looked at in terms of predicting child outcomes. And so I think what is one thing that's important to take away from this is that screen time is only one of many different factors that do contribute to child outcomes, but it is one of the easiest to modify. So particularly when we're thinking about early childhood years, parents do have, a lot of control over what children are doing, what they're watching on screens, how much time they're spending. So while a lot of these factors parents might not have control over them, this is something that parents can control and modify if they want to. Okay, so in the previous analysis, we were just looking at screen time at one point in time. So for example, looking at screen time at age 2, predicting outcomes at age 5. But what might be more important to consider is kind of the cumulative effects or cumulative exposure to screen time across childhood. So if we just look at one particular measurement at age 2, that might not really be reflective of, what a child has been doing on screens across their whole childhood. So that's what we aim to look at in the next analysis. So kind of getting at the cumulative impact of screen time across childhood. So what we did here was use a latent profile analysis. And so that allows us to look at kind of these common patterns that emerge within the data set and assign children to those patterns. So this is using children's screen time measured from 9 months up to 8 years. And through this latent profile analysis, we identified the best fit to the data was these 4 profile groups. So what each of these lines is representing now is 4 different groups of children. With these common patterns or trajectories of screen use across childhood. So that top line, that solid blue line, we labeled this group the high exposure group, because as we can see, these children after 9 months had, by far the highest levels of screen exposure across childhood. That next group, the solid red line, we labeled this one the moderate exposure group because they generally had moderate levels of screen time compared to other children across childhood. Then that dashed red line, so we've labeled this group the late onset exposure group because we can see that from age 4 onwards, they're pretty much the same as that moderate exposure group. So they have a moderate level of screen time. But what happened for them was kind of those infancy and toddler years, they had quite low screen exposure. So we kind of labeled this the late onset exposure group. They had low screen time for the first couple of years of life, which increased to a moderate level after that. And then that final group across the bottom, that dashed line, we labeled this the low exposure group. And these children consistently had the lowest levels of screen time across childhood. So we see that it's only just above 2 hours at age 8. And then if we look at that little table up in the corner there, this is showing how many children from the sample of over 6,000 children were assigned to each of these groups. And so what we can see is that actually that high exposure group was the most frequent pattern that we saw. So 40% of children kind of belong to this pattern of screen exposure across childhood, whereas that low exposure pattern was the least common. So then what we did was look at children's outcomes predicted from these trajectories. So based on children's screen time across childhood, what are their outcomes? So first looking at those same outcomes. So at age 5 and age 8, these are providing the standardized mean score on these outcomes based on those 4 screen trajectory groups. And these have been adjusted for children's ethnicity, maternal age, maternal education, socioeconomic deprivation, and childcare attendance. And so if we look at the 2 on the left here, so this is children's language and educational ability at 5. We can see that children who were in the low exposure profile across childhood have the highest levels of language and educational ability, whereas those in the high exposure profile score lowest in their language and educational ability. And if in terms of language skills there, if we kind of compare that moderate exposure and late onset exposure, we can see that there is some benefit there for that late onset exposure group of having those first couple years with low screen exposure in terms of their later language skills. And then if we look at peer problems on the right-hand side here, we can see that high exposure group, they're scoring much higher in their peer problems at age 5, where there's, not kind of that negative effect for any of the other 3 trajectory groups. What we did next then was now extend this to look at children's outcomes at age 12. So remember, these 4 groups are looking at their screen time from age 9 months up to age 8 years. And then we looked at, okay, well, what's happening for these children when they're at age 12? And so we first looked at how those screen trajectory profiles predicted children's media use outcomes at age 12. And again, in this analysis, all of these have been adjusted for ethnicity, maternal education, socioeconomic deprivation, household income, and maternal depression. And so if we look at that the first figures here on the left hand, this is just predicting children's weekly screen time at age 12 from those screen exposure trajectories. So we can see that children who had high screen exposure across childhood now have the highest screen exposure at age 12, and that low exposure group is showing the lowest screen time at age 12. So over childhood, parents have a lot of control over their children, but as we get to age 12, youth are starting to have more control over their own, activities and how they spend their time. And we're kind of seeing that these habits, these patterns across childhood, are, fulfilled continuing on at age 12. And we also, at age 12, looked at problematic media use, which is kind of a more clinically relevant measure of children's screen use, as this is basically screen media addiction. So it's kind of looking at those addictive type behaviors, but we do call it problematic media use. And so here we can see that children who had that high exposure profile across childhood are showing the highest levels of problematic media use at age 12, the highest level of addictive symptoms, whereas that low exposure profile, are showing the lowest levels of problematic media use. And we also looked at digital competency at age 12. And this one is interesting because this was actually reported by the children's teachers. So these other 4 outcomes that I've got here were all self-reported by the children themselves, but digital competency was rated by their teacher. And here we found that children who had the low exposure of screen time across childhood scored highest in their digital competency at age 12. And then finally, in terms of kind of developmental outcomes, we looked at children's internalizing and externalizing symptoms at age 12. And so you might be familiar with these concepts, but internalizing symptoms are things like symptoms of anxiety and depression. So those kind of internal emotional type symptoms. Externalizing symptoms are more behavioral, so things like conduct problems or hyperactivity. And so we can see that children who had that high exposure profile across childhood show the highest levels of internalizing and externalizing symptoms at 12, whereas there's that beneficial effect as well of having low exposure across childhood. And so kind of the key conclusions from this study were that we do see some benefits of that low exposure screen trajectory at outcomes at age 5, 8, and 12 across social, educational, psychological functioning, and media use outcomes. And also, I think quite interestingly, we did find some benefit for that late onset exposure, so that keeping screen time low during infancy and toddlerhood, that was beneficial for language development as well as preventing problematic media use. And yeah, just kind of with that idea of habit forming, we see that these trajectories of screen use across early and middle childhood are highly predictive of later screen use in adolescence, including problematic media use. And I think one particular point that I find quite interesting is that we found that low screen use over childhood does not impede the development of digital competency. And I think this is important because I think that's a common criticism of the idea of suggesting that children should have very low screen time across childhood is the idea that we live in a digital world. Children need to learn how to use digital tools and use them safely, which I completely agree with. But I think what our research is showing is that even very low levels of screen time across childhood are completely sufficient and apparently beneficial to developing digital competency. So just in terms of what this included, teachers rated children on 7 different aspects of digital competency, which included ability to critically evaluate information found online, find information online effectively and safely, and a basic understanding of not sharing personal details online. All right, and so I've got one more study that I'm going to talk about, and this kind of shifts focus a little bit. So I think when we're thinking about kind of impacts of screen time on children's later, particularly psychological functioning. I think what we've focused on so far is kind of how there might be these broader developmental impacts of children's screen time that might influence later outcomes. So the idea that children's screen time kind of displaces social interactions, physical activity, sleep, and, might impact the quality of their relationships and these different skills that they're developing. But I think the other side of things, in terms of what might have impacts for children's psychological functioning, is some of the specific online experiences they have. So what actually happens when they're online. So things like exposure to harmful content, experiences of cyber victimization, which is the idea that the more time children are spending online, the more opportunities there are for them to have these kind of exposure to these risks or experience these kind of harmful situations. So the last study that I'll just talk about is where we looked at children's experiences of online harm in middle childhood. This was again using the Growing Up in New Zealand data set, looking at data when children were aged 8. So when they were 8, we found that 1 in 4 children reported that they had experienced some type of online harm. And so this was just asking children if they'd experienced something online that had worried, bothered, or upset them. So 26.6% of children said yes, this had happened to them. And this figure here is just showing the different types of online harm that children had experienced. So the most common thing they experienced was exposure to sites, games, or images that were meant for grown-ups. But some of the other things you can see were things like peer pressure, talking to someone they didn't know or that they shouldn't talk to, or bullying of themselves and others. And so we looked at kind of predicting, well, like what are the predictors of children experiencing online harm? And so we examined a range of different child, family, and media vulnerability and predictive factors that were measured both concurrently at age 8 as well as longitudinally, so things from earlier in childhood. And we kind of found that there was 3 key predictors that emerged in terms of predicting online harm at age 8. So the first just being children's own behavioral challenges. So these children who had more issues with behavior regulation were more likely to have experienced online harm. So kind of that idea that, offline they're having more behavioral challenges, maybe more risky behavior, that this kind of translate perhaps to how they're behaving online. We also found the number of personal devices. So the more devices a child had, the more likely they were to experience online harm. And so when we did look at screen time as well, but we found it was actually the number of devices was a more important predictor than just the total amount of time that they spent on screens. And then the other factor was parent-reported kind of internet communication and safety in the home. But what we actually found was maybe the reverse of what you might think. So parents who reported more internet communication and safety features in the home, their children were more likely to report experiencing online harm. But so the internet communication and safety was measured at age 8 when we asked children about online harm. So we think what this might actually show is that because these children had experienced online harm, that actually parents were responding by talking to their child about what had happened and maybe implementing some safety features. And then finally, we looked at, okay, well, what are the consequences for children of experiencing online harm? So we looked at these different outcomes and found that children who had reported experiences of online harm reported lower levels of self-worth and more depressive symptoms at age 8. So that graph there is just showing mean levels of depressive symptoms for those who had not experienced online harm in blue and who had in green. So just to kind of wrap up with the key messages from all of this. So we did find across our studies that high levels of screen use are associated with a number of poor developmental outcomes. So lower language skills, educational skills, and social skills in early to middle childhood, and then higher problematic media use and internalizing and externalizing symptoms in adolescence. And so I think these kind of impacts on children's psychological functioning and well-being may result from both the broader developmental impacts as well as some of these specific online experiences that they're having. And so just in terms of the recommendations of, in terms of what I would recommend to parents is that when we're thinking about early childhood, I think the screen time limits are really important. The amount of time children are on screens is important, and it's really important that we're making sure that children have enough time for these other types of activities that are really critical for their development. Things like playing outside, physically running around, playing with toys, interacting with other people. So it's really important that they're able to balance kind of screen activities with non-screen activities. I also think just being knowledgeable about child screen use, so talking to your children about what they're doing online. If they want to play some new game or app, just kind of having a quick look into what they're actually going to be doing on that app. And and then there's also a number of ways that we know that children's media use can be kind of turned into something positive. So kind of the most important here being joint media engagement. So when parents kind of sit with their child, talk to them about what the child's watching, ask them questions, they kind of turn it into an opportunity for social interaction and for conversation. Yeah, rather than just putting the children on the screen and leaving them to it. So that's everything that I'm going to present today. Definitely happy to answer some questions now, but I've also put up my email address there because I'm more than happy for anyone to get in touch by email as well. Thank you.
Megan, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Sharing.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yes, no problem. Sorry.
No, not at all. Megan, that was really superb. Thank you so much. I have a list of questions myself. I'd just like to say, everyone, that it's bedtime for Megan. So not only was that presentation superb, but you're doing it at bedtime. So I'm doubly impressed. I have a list of questions, but I just wondered if anyone would like to ask questions instead of or ahead of me. You can either put those in the question and answer box, or if you like, so we've got a quite small elite group here of health professionals that I can see, we can pop on your mics to ask Megan directly. Just while we start to look for hands being up, or Q&A text, can I just ask you, Megan, when you're observing child outcomes in those wonderful pieces of research that you presented, what sort of parental feedback did you get?
In terms of the developmental outcomes?
Yes, and their kind of views on the impacts of screens, because they obviously consented to be participants in this research. Did you find that they were surprised by new learning, that it enriched their parenting abilities, that they gave feedback as to how they'd like this to be incorporated into how families are helped? I'm just interested to know did you get any family feedback?
Well, so I mean, most of the data that I've reported is from the Growing Up in New Zealand study, right? So they are kind of assessed across a whole wide range of different kind of health, nutrition, all different types of outcomes. So it's really the study itself doesn't have a focus on screen time, and they kind of don't really get that type of feedback from families. But I guess I would say, just from talking to parents, across other research and just informally, I definitely think that parents are noticing a lot of these things. I especially think kind of with the behavior and attention is something that parents notice, and kind of the the tantrums that young children show when they get the screen time and then you try to take it away. They kind of notice that children have these kind of behavior regulation issues, and I think parents see that can kind of come from too much screen time or using it in the wrong ways. But yeah, I think parents also find it very hard because it's such an easy thing to do. So I know parents are kind of conflicted about that, about knowing that it might have these negative impacts for their child. But yeah, they're kind of busy and overwhelmed and stressed, and so it's something that's very easy for them to do.
Absolutely, and we can all appreciate that as parents. I mean, we know how stressful it is managing life, work around young children as well. But I find, and a lot of our health professionals find, that parents don't see the harms and haven't associated or joined the dots. And that's something that worries us, as particularly children living in our most vulnerable and deprived backgrounds, that maybe for whatever reason, and by no fault of their own, parents haven't realised the full impacts. So one of our questions from our professionals is, how can we best manage this, and how do we get this important information over to parents in a timely and sensitive way?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think just informing parents, like about even just things like the screen time guidelines and letting them know about these kind of results. So with a couple of the other researchers that I work with, we've kind of started onto this of trying to translate our results into something that's actually meaningful for people. So kind of creating these type of infographics or kind of social media posts, things that get our results out, but in a very simple, easy to understand way to try to get the message out there, but in a way that's not putting kind of that parental guilt on people. I know a lot of people are kind of against the putting the screen time guidelines out there because it's really hard for parents to stick to them. But I think, as you say, in some of these kind of low income neighborhoods or families, they actually have no idea what is an appropriate amount of time. So I think just having kind of this type of recommendation gives them at least like a ballpark of what you could be aiming for, and just the idea that there can be these negative effects for children.
Yeah, brilliant. Because that's an information gap, isn't it, at the moment? So these poor parents can't be blamed a lot of the time. It was really compelling, Megan, to hear about the impact of screen time, which includes background television, on these children's language outcomes. And we have got a lot of speech and language therapists on our group. We've got Sandy Chappell, who's one of our most senior speech and language therapists, who's asking you, saying to you, this all reflects, Megan, what I see in my clinic as a speech and language therapist. One of the problems I now have is children being exposed to a lot of screen time in early years settings. So nurseries, educational settings. Every setting I visit has a large smart screen playing nursery rhymes, songs, etc., playing for most of the day, as well as being used to teach early phonics and maths. Any advice about how to get the message across to schools and settings?
Yeah, that's hard because I definitely think, like, I know, the devices are kind of taking over the primary schools, and it is kind of moving into the early childhood sector. I think luckily in New Zealand we haven't seen that as much here, but I have heard that that is the case in the UK. I mean, I think there's very little research that has been done. And I mean, I think that's the issue, that kind of, I guess, the devices are kind of infiltrating early childhood centers without there being any research to show whether that's, beneficial or harmful. So I definitely think we need some type of research looking at whether that is beneficial for children. But I don't know. I guess even just, the type of research that I do, kind of showing, and all the other research that exists showing how important these kind of face-to-face interactions are during early childhood, and just that kind of tactile sensory needs that they have during early childhood. I mean, I really just it shouldn't be replaced with screens, but I'm not really sure what the quick and easy solution is to that.
Well, it's in the education of communicating the outcomes, isn't it? And reinforcing the completely obvious of what we already know about how to raise a healthy child. It's a little bit sad, isn't it, that we seem to have forgotten this in the haze of technology coming into our lives. Something really compelling you said on the back of this, Megan, is that this is a force against what you're saying, which is obviously the most important around how we raise healthy children. But we're up against this myth over here. We particularly feel this, that using this tech early helps them to use it better and more safely later. When you said lower screen use over childhood does not impede the development of digital competency. I mean, alleluia. I mean, that is just so wonderful to see that coming out of a research department. And again, we should know this, and we should be saying this repeatedly to governments to let them bust the myth that they need this early to do better on it later. Are you as frustrated with policymakers over there in New Zealand? Because we're crawling the walls here.
I mean, I don't think it makes sense that children have to be on devices before they turn 5 in order for them to like be skilled later on. You can hand a child a tablet and they can figure it out easily. And I think, I mean, what our research shows is, the longer that they wait, kind of they kind of develop those regulation skills. I mean, there's always the argument that children should be given devices so they can develop their own self-regulation skills of using devices. But I think what we know from other research areas, is it always starts with the parental kind of the co-regulation, which as they get older can transfer to the child. So I really think that, parents having these kind of limits and regulations during early childhood is what sets children up to have those kind of healthy habits later on. But yeah, I think I don't know of any other research that's kind of looked at this similar type of thing of children's screen time, kind of like across childhood and later kind of digital competency. So yeah, I think that that's quite an important finding.
No, your longitudinal research, the growing up in New Zealand and looking at those
Mm,
outcomes at those three age stages is incredibly powerful, Megan, and it's seriously
yeah.
got our attention. Can we ask you
Mm.
a little bit? It's been quite topical in the press this week about there's been a dramatic drop off in children reading for pleasure. And do you
Uh,
do you
mm.
do you have any observations or advice around that? Have you observed the same thing in
Um,
relation to screen time? What would be your view there?
Yeah, I haven't wouldn't say I've looked at that in my research, but I think definitely from reading other research and things, I think that's that is definitely the case. And I think that it is just that fact of, yeah, the more time children are spending on screens, it's taking time away from other activities. But also if we think about, reading for children is quite, a cognitively demanding type of task, whereas it's very easy to just kind of zone out and watch short videos. So I think that, because this is true of adults as well. Adults are spending much less time reading and instead they're going on screens. It's just like, it's just hard. You have to kind of have that willpower to say, no, I'm actually going to sit down and read a book instead of going on screens. So I think it's just one more activity that's being kind of pushed away by devices.
Yeah, and we're being asked the question through a evidence gathering exercise over here. What challenges to reading are posed by increased screen time, and how can technology better be used to read for pleasure? Do you
Mm.
feel technology can be better used for that? Because
Well, I don't know. So I do think like there is definitely research looking at reading between different modes, and that people, reading like a hard copy book show better kind of reading comprehension, and kind of follow the narrative plot better when it's on a physical book rather than on, reading electronically on a screen. So there definitely are some differences in terms of what happens reading on one device than another. I definitely think I do think there can be some benefits. So some of the kind of phonics type programs that have been developed to kind of build those early reading skills like phonological awareness, children become really engaged in those kind of things. So I definitely think there can be some, specific apps or programs that can be beneficial for kind of teaching children specific skills. But I think in terms of, yeah, reading for pleasure, learning to read, at least in my opinion, I do think you need to have that kind of, yeah, relationship with physical books rather than reading on devices.
and particularly the importance our speech and language therapists are concerned about. A lot of these phonics and apps are not evidence-based, or they're being used with
Yeah.
children who are too young. And
Yeah.
we know
So I will say,
that,
I actually just had another paper that was published today, actually, where we looked at that. So we looked at mobile apps that were, claiming to be teaching reading or early reading skills. And so I think we found that was over 9,000 apps that were on the market. And we had, yeah, a team of expert SLTs rate them in terms of whether they were actually teaching early skills and whether they were beneficial for children. And we found that there was only 85 out of almost 10,000 apps that were actually of like high quality like for children. So I think it's like a very, very small number of apps that are on the market are actually teaching children skills and like, genuinely beneficial for their early reading. So again, it's really hard for parents to be able to figure out, and educators to figure out, what children should be using.
goodness me, could you send us that over, Megan?
Oh yeah, sure. As I said, it was just published
Because
today, so I haven't had a
that
chance to send it to you
confirms
yet.
every suspicion from our SLTs in particular.
Yeah.
That's worrying in itself, isn't it? So we're nearing the end, Megan, because you need to get on. Well, go to bed, actually.
Go to bed. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask one final question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
We obviously are health professionals working in the clinical environment, and we are absolutely fascinated by academic research such as yours, and how that transposes into how we practice as health professionals and how we speak to parents. How have clinicians received your research? Have you got any plans for working with clinicians or getting this sort of research into the kind of public health environment? How do you see this going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I probably would say I haven't really had that much kind of contact with clinicians in terms of, using them as a way to get the message out there. I tend to focus more on talking to parents and developing resources directly for parents. But I have in the past presented to other groups of clinicians, and I think, yeah, they've all been very receptive to these kind of finds, and kind of the same thing that you're saying, that they're seeing the evidence of this in their practice, and so they're very receptive to the findings. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's a space there to be doing something in terms of getting either resources or information that clinicians can use to provide advice to families. So obviously you're, on the ground seeing families every day that, and, a lot of families who are, would be particularly in need of this information. So yeah, I think that could be something really important to consider in terms of, yeah, how clinicians can be kind of sharing this advice and research with families.
Mm. Well, for the moment, Megan, we are using what we have from very important research projects like your own. I cannot tell you how powerful it is, and pioneering in light of the deteriorations in school readiness that we're seeing. And as you said in your presentation, there's a number of factors that contribute to children's outcomes, but this is such an easily modifiable one.
Yeah.
I know not easy to do, and it can be difficult for parents, but it's
Yeah.
a very straightforward, modifiable factor that we should be communicating loudly to parents and families and professionals to endorse because of the impact on children's outcomes. So this really has been such a fascinating talk, and we are so grateful. And this turnout, this time in the morning, is our best for an early lecture, and it will be repeatedly watched on the recordings as well, Megan. So there's lovely comments coming in now as well, which we can share with you afterwards.
Oh,
So
that would be lovely. Thank you.
thank you ever so much. You go and have the end of your day finally, and thank you for giving us your time at the end of a busy day at work.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for all the work that you're doing as well too. It's amazing. So I really appreciate that. And yeah, thanks for everyone turning out today.
Brilliant, Megan. Thanks ever so much.
Okay.
Bye.
See you. Thank you.